Welcome everyone to the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and to our discussion of global cities, new powers in security, migration and development. We're going to start now in timely fashion, but I'm aware that the tube lines are not running very well, so some people may filter in late. But we'll begin nonetheless. Now, 2 days ago, the UK Ministry of Defence launched the 6th edition of its Global Strategic Trends here at the IISS. It's intended to inform the UK's national and international security planning for the coming years. And in it, the Ministry of Defence highlighted both the diffusion of powers away from nation-states towards cities, and increasing urbanisation as key strategic trends. So it's quite appropriate that we, so shortly afterwards, have this discussion of global cities. And I hope that today, in this discussion, we will understand better the particular challenges faced by cities and the particular role cities can and should play. So I'm very pleased to introduce this panel with an incredible depth of expertise. We have, first of all, to my left, Dr. Philip Broder of the LSE Cities. He is Executive Director there, and will be talking to us about the role of cities in local and global governance. To his left, but speaking third, is my colleague Antonio Sampaio, who leads our work on urban security here at IISS, and I highly commend to you his recent foreign policy article, "The New Front Lines Are in the Slums." To his left, but speaking second, is Juliana Kerr, who is Director of Global Cities and Immigration at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and has written especially on cities' role in immigration and on sanctuary cities in the United States. And finally, at the furthest end of the table is Carlotta Rebello, who is the producer of the Urbanist podcast from Monocle magazine, and she will be responding to the comments of Philip, Antonio, and Juliana. First of all, I'd like to turn to Philip to introduce the idea of global cities and the role you think they can play.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here and to be sharing with you, in some ways, our own very particular insight into this debate around global cities and their role globally. When I say we, I refer to LSE Cities at the London School of Economics, and in particular a signature program we have been running over the last 15 years called the Urban Age Program. I need to make a disclaimer up front. We are seeing here three very important headlines: security, migration and development. I can't claim the territory of security and migration as my area of expertise. I probably am happier with development. I do mainly work on research related to urban policy, planning, design, transport, and broader institutional analysis of urban development. We also, I think, need to clarify right up front, when we talk about global cities or cities more generally, are we talking about individual city governments? Are we talking about networks of city governments? Or a much broader coming together of city-level coalitions, both within a defined territory of a city or even then, again, in a more networked character? But let me wind back and share with you the Urban Age journey. So the Urban Age program is essentially a network of different groups concerned about the transition into a majority urban global condition. We have held 16 conferences since 2004 in major world cities, usually bringing together heads of state, mayors, urban practitioners and academics to engage in a debate on timely issues affecting that very region we were holding the event in, but also projecting into the future some of the crucial questions for policymakers. And if I can remind you of the reason why we set this up in 2004, because it really resonates with a lot of, I think, the implications of setting up the event today, this was a period where out of several European mayoral networks which we curated, there was an enormous push and appetite for bringing together city-level decision makers. Within Europe, we had a strong debate about a Europe of cities led by Pascal Maragall, the former mayor of Barcelona, and there was an incredible energy around overcoming the nation state. That was really the sentiment. People bought into this. It was the era of cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, the open city, as my colleague at the LSE, Richard Sennett, would call it. It was the period of setting up first C8, then C20, then C40. The latter is probably familiar to you. So that is the network of global cities trying to accelerate action around climate change. It was the period of recognizing, first having journalists here on the panel, journalists were very excited about the 50% mark. 50% of the world population is urban. That happened supposedly in 2007. Completely artificial number. Doesn't matter to anyone on the ground, but it did advance a conversation. And in 2005, there was a wonderful Time magazine cover. Meet the mayors of Rome, Stockholm, London, Berlin, and Paris were seen again within a European context as the new leaders. Who cares about national government? So here, that was the starting point. Then we entered a different period, 2008 to 2014, the Great Recession. We led work with the Brookings Institution on economic recovery of cities in different world regions. And for the first time in our wonderful celebration of cities, had to acknowledge that the performance of cities in terms of recovery could by 70 to 80% be explained by their national performance, the performance of their national countries. We then had a wonderfully interesting event with the late Benjamin Barber before he launched his book, If Mayor Ruled the World, in 2012. And we had with LSE academics a fierce debate at that moment whether the whole idea of more locally organized governments actually being really here in the shaping role of global governance is appropriate, because the same weeks you had all the stories about Euro collapse and national governments coming together. It all of a sudden no longer resonated with people who really worked particularly at the national level of government. So this is a bit than the urban recognition. In 2013, we were in Rio de Janeiro with our event at the time where already Rio had peaked. Rio, up to then, celebrated. It's another star of the global cities. Wonderful. It's all going ahead. But when we held the event, it already smelled like trouble. And you know what happened with Rio de Janeiro ever since, and not just with Rio, but the broader context.
I've been telling them repeatedly.
Now, the final period gets maybe even more schizophrenic. Yes, we had urban SDGs, big fight by some of us trying to ensure that the national governments agreed to urban-specific sustainable development goals. We had the Paris Agreement, which was, a bit promoted by the urban angle, but ultimately, there are two references in the entire agreement to cities. But we also had the New Urban Agenda by UN Habitat, which took forward these ideas. So mainstreaming urban has become big and a global movement, but it has also taken out urban from the city. It has put it higher up at different tiers of government, and I think we need to recognize this. We of course have new populism, Trump, Brexit, and our concern about the future of the nation state, I think, is far more elevated than ever before over the last 20 years, and we need to recognize that a lot of this is actually due to the rise of cities as well. So the left behind of the region, my colleague at the LSE, Andres Rodriguez-Pusey, has just published a piece, he's an economist, on the revenge of the places that don't matter. The left behind places. It's the polar opposite of the success of the Londons, New Yorks, and Tokyos, and so on, what we are seeing in many parts of the world. We can't go on without incorporating development in those more peripheral, smaller places, less globalized places. And we have severe challenges to, I think, the most fundamental values which underpin the global city around cosmopolitanism and progressiveness. So let me now finish with 3 points which we may want to discuss. The want to do in terms of cities, the can do, and the actual impact. If you ask any person in government at any level, there's a natural inclination to claim greater territories and remits. Why not, right? I mean, if you're the mayor of London, to be elevated and be responsible for more to a certain degree is always an intuition. There's also a very strong enhanced tendency of this through recognizing that the national is a bit of a politically regressive territory, and we really need to counteract and maintain our cosmopolitan perspective. But there's a recognition of limited resources. The reality is the Mayor of London actually doesn't have a lot of cash to do a lot of the things he may or she may want to do. So that brings us to the can-do. We did a survey of about 80 cities globally in more than 50 countries, which looked at the actual self-assessed power, the self-assessed leadership in different policy sectors. And the first question we ask is about, in which urban sectors do governments in general actually take the lead, as opposed to private, third, and informal sectors? The top three, spatial planning, policing and security, here you have it, and urban transport, recognized as public sector led, so this is where government plays a role. The bottom three, culture, housing and economic development, where governments in cities generally are seen as not taking the lead. If we then move to a second question about the different spheres of government or tiers of government and their responsibility and leadership in relation to urban policy sectors, we get the following top three. Again, spatial planning, really recognized as a core competency of cities. Culture, as a policy area, again, where cities are in the lead. And utilities and transport. At the bottom, we have economic development, education and health, usually national government. That brings me to the third point, the actual impact of all of this. Clearly, cities seem to be in charge, in the driving seat, around the physical development, the shaping, the three-dimensional space creation. And that's a very, very important responsibility, because it's possibly the most long-term policy tool we have. Most national governments do not have these very long-term policy tools. The infrastructure, where to build, where not to build. But there's big informality. Maybe not in London, but in many places I work in, governments don't control the spatial shape of the city. We have infrastructure development, which is centrally led by cities, but the big budgets remain national, or they need to get from the market. So there's a big dependency, which we need to acknowledge. And finally, if we take issues like environmental regulations, where cities are often celebrated as talking, I think, the talk in town. But think about who is currently forcing London to act, Stuttgart to act, Hamburg to act. It's EU regulation on air quality. These cities are being sued, and they will have to pay if they don't get their act together. And I think that's something which, again, we should not dismiss. So I think I wanted to provoke a bit, because I could have now been speaking about celebration of world cities and how much they are powerful, but I think it's important that from an urban community we recognize the national is very important.
Thank you very much, Philip. Now, Juliana, that tension between the national and the local is very strong when it comes to immigration in the United States.
Can't be more.
Oh, we can.
Can't be more evident right now. Very timely.
So perhaps you could talk a little bit about the role of cities in this migration policy debate.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all for having me here today. I'm from Chicago. I'm from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We are a think tank based in Chicago. We've been around for 92 years, looking at foreign policy issues, traditional international relations type of studies. Our president now is the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. And he came to the Chicago Council with a really strong background on national security and security policy. And I remember one of his first days at the organization, he said, one topic, one non-state actor that nobody's really talking about that's going to disrupt global governance and the future world order are the global cities. And so he launched a big portfolio, a big research agenda at the Chicago Council that looks at cities and their role in addressing global challenges, not just now, today, but their potential role, right? Where are we headed, and how is the world going to look very different than the way that it's been operating for the past few hundred years? We also hosted a conference, so we started, this will be our 5th year, we're organizing a Chicago Forum on Global Cities that we host in partnership with the Financial Times newspaper. Journalists come out to Chicago, moderate a whole series of sessions over 3 days, looking and exploring a variety of different issues: economic development, security policy, immigration, climate, education, the future of work. I mean, a whole breadth of issues, and how cities can help lead solutions and work with either private sector or nation-state level governance to develop solutions to the problems that the world is facing. So in that context, I'm really going to focus on the immigration debate in the United States, because one of the things that you pointed out is that each country in their national systems will actually allow for the independence and autonomy of cities in different ways. And I think as we look at the power of cities in their different governments, it really does depend on the constitutions of the countries. In the United States, one of the things that we have discovered is that cities actually have a little bit more autonomy, perhaps, than in some other places around the world. And you're starting to see mayors really advocate for, rather than layers of hierarchy of governance, where the national government, the state, and the city are kind of in a hierarchical session, that they're seeing it as spheres of governance. Cities are responsible for this, national is responsible for that, state over here, and then there's some overlapping pieces of the Venn diagram where they each have different pieces of it. But they're really advocating for that kind of autonomy on the areas where they can have influence. When we look at the immigration debate in the United States, especially over the past year, but this is something that's been going on for decades, is this big call for reforms, right? We're working on immigration policy that since 1965, we haven't really had a major overhaul on our system. There's been a huge demand, and if anybody's been following the immigration debate, decades of trying to get new bills passed at the federal level to expand visas for high-skilled workers that meet more of today's realities. We always recognize that the tech sector didn't even exist when the laws were made, for the 65,000 cap that we offer in high-school visas a year. There's demands for creating new visas at the low-skilled level for all of the hospitality or agriculture or just service economy, basically. There aren't visas that exist in our system. So there's been demands upon demands for updating our laws that meet today's realities. And what you're seeing is this constant block. And on top of that, we have the additional tension of the 11 million undocumented immigrants who currently live in the country with no clear direction or path for what's going to happen to these individuals, especially for ones who have been living there for 2 decades, 3 decades. I mean, entire families who had come under different programs, different workforce opportunity programs. A lot, like 40-50% of the immigrants in the country are people who came over legally and then overstayed visas and have stayed. So there's a huge complexity around what to do with the undocumented population. And what we've seen over the years is this lack of ability for the nation state to really tackle and come to a consensus on how they're going to solve these big challenges that the country is facing when it comes to a significant portion of our population. And that's where the mayors start to step in. The mayors are, as Ben Barber and a variety of others have talked about, the pragmatic ones, the ones who are dealing with people on the ground. And we had the honor of hosting Ben Barber, and he was really big on the immigration debate, because for him it was, these are people. This isn't about policy. This isn't about visas. This isn't about quotas. These are about human beings living in our communities, opening businesses, sending their children to school, just living and being a part of the fabric of our society. And that's where the mayors came in and said, we don't want to see all these challenges that our society is facing, these stresses. We need this solved. And so we've organized task forces and different conversations around the Midwest region, looking at the impact on jails if we're going to ask these cities to now start enforcing immigration enforcement and deporting their jail cells. They're not equipped to do that. They're not trained to do that. That's really the job of immigration enforcement at the national level. So we talked to sheriffs about, what do they want to see done? And they're like, we're not going to do enforcement. We talked to mayors of towns, and they said, we need to be able to incorporate and offer opportunities for immigrants in our community. We're not going to focus exclusively on the enforcement procedures. And under the Trump administration, what we've seen is this huge tension, because he ran on a platform that was entirely built about getting rid of the undocumented immigrants in our country, limiting legal immigration in the country, and basically turning around so many of the other policies that had been implemented under President Obama, who has also been criticized on immigration. But in the meantime, we have our city stepping in. And one of the frameworks that we're trying to look at the Chicago Council is through the climate action work. So President Trump last year announced that the United States was going to be the only country in the world to not fulfill the commitments of the Paris Agreement. And all of the cities across the United States said, you know what, it doesn't matter if the president doesn't want the United States to be a part of this commitment, we are still in. And an entire momentum was built around, with C40 taking the lead, the Global Covenant of Mayors, and they got over 1,400 cities, businesses, universities, counties to commit to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement despite what the president said. When you think about that collective action, and when you were asking about whether it's the city proper or a collection or a network of cities coming together, but the capacity of these cities to affect change on an issue at a global scale without needing that leadership at the top level is really powerful. So these cities, all the emissions that are coming out of the cities, they're going to enforce their own building codes, they're going to update their transportation systems, they're going to do what it takes to meet these commitments. If you take that framework and apply it to the immigration lens, where can cities deliver? So cities have typically been thought of as places for immigrant integration. They offer services, they help with housing. In the United States, many cities across the country have opened up offices of New Americans, which is something that I'm starting to find is rarer and rarer. I don't know how many cities in Europe have opened up offices of New Americans, but I feel like that's actually extraordinarily rare in Asian countries. But there's 20, 30 different cities, and it's not just New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, but it's Atlanta and Tulsa and Grand Rapids, little cities across the country that have offices of immigrant affairs that are looking at putting citizenship offices in their libraries, or helping with English as a second language training. They offer a lot of different services. Immigrant integration has typically been how we think of cities and the work that they do. But now, under our current administration, they have found themselves, these directors of these immigrant offices, as being voices on a national stage for reforms in ways that they were never asked to be before. And they are coming out very strong in multiple ways. So one of the ways that we see cities really kind of making a difference in ways that they didn't traditionally do on immigration policy is acting on their own priorities and agendas. We've seen this with the sanctuary cities debate across the country, which is Chicago has been the headline. So it's been kind of exciting to be based there in watching all of this unfold. But the sanctuary city debate is another reaffirmation of the autonomy of a city, that it's not their responsibility to enforce what is the responsibility of the national government. So immigration enforcement comes out of the Department of Homeland Security. There's people that are hired and trained to do that. It's not up to the municipal law force and police. What our mayor was President Trump. I don't know who's followed this story, but definitely read way too much about it back in my hometown. But President Trump was going to start withdrawing any kind of federal grants to Chicago, that any city across the country, but in Chicago in particular, for not obliging and helping enforce immigration laws and deporting, having the municipal office deport immigrants who are there without status. And our mayor said, no, that's not our responsibility. You can't make me do it. And he sued the Department of Justice. And the courts sided with the city. The courts said, correct, Chicago is in its right. No city, the national government cannot commandeer a city government to do its work. And so that re-emphasized this kind of autonomy of cities. And now we have over 300 cities across the United States who have these jurisdictions where it's not a sanctuary, you're not completely free. I mean, if immigration enforcement comes to the city, they can still do their operations. But what's going to happen is if you get picked up by a police officer for speeding, he's not going to turn you in, and because you don't have documents. So there's a little bit of clarification on that. Cities have also been issuing municipal IDs. It's a whole new program that allows anybody, whether they have status or no status, to have access to these IDs. Chicago has a scholarship program that anybody who qualifies and meets certain criteria can go to community colleges for free, again, documented or undocumented, they don't really care. They're enacting so many policies within their jurisdictions that basically render your status as irrelevant because you can continue operating and living a wholesome life. There's a lot of bigger questions about your future, but the idea of operating and living within the city is something that cities have been advancing. They've also been doing a lot of collective action. So you've seen memorandum coming out, there's Cities for Action networks like C40 coming together really aggressively, trying to issue memos and trying to shape policy. There's bilateral diplomacy happening across countries, and this was something just very briefly because I don't want to go on too long. But when the president took office, there was huge, really offensive remarks being made about the Mexicans in the United States, and so mayors from Mexican cities, from Guadalajara and Juarez and Mexico City, came to the United States on a mayor-to-mayor diplomatic tour, meeting with the mayors of Los Angeles and Chicago and Houston, and saying, these are our people. Can we agree that whatever's happening at the national level, we're still protecting, we're still friends, right? We're still on the same page about our communities, and they talked about the protections that they had and the healthcare coverage that they had back in Mexico, and there was a lot of collaboration from city to city with the mayors across countries.
I am going to pause you there.
You're going to pause me?
We can come back and get
so
questions.
Very briefly,
Sure. Yeah.
That's the summary, is that you're seeing a lot more momentum, and the question ultimately is, to what extent are they going to be able to continue down this path, recognizing that immigration is actually, it is the national government who decides. So that's my big wrap.
Yeah. Particularly useful there. One of the first things you mentioned was these different spheres of government, so the different levels of government, and obviously there are overlapping bits. Now, security is obviously one of those very overlapping bits. So what is the particular contribution of cities to security issues, and what's particularly unique about issues of urban security?
Yeah, well, security is part of the spheres of what is usually called high politics or high diplomacy. So I think there has been less progress in terms of urban involvement, or slightly slower progress on involvement of cities on security issues, particularly the ones that are more associated with national security. So I'm going to focus on two issues, which are international terrorism and organized crime. So obviously, local crime has always been, an area of strong urban involvement. But what we see now in the global south, especially, is the growing need, not only interest and capacity, but need to tackle organized crime, including organized crime that sometimes controls territories. So it is important to remember that despite the rising interest and the rise of networks of cities such as the C40 and the role of cities in many international issues like migration, this rise of cities in the global stage has come with some noticeable gaps. So, for instance, last August, the UN high-level panel reviewed the effectiveness of UN Habitat, which is one of the least recognized and most cash-strapped arms of the United Nations system, pointing to a failure, and I quote, failure within the UN system to adequately acknowledge the pace, scale, and implications of urbanization, end quote. And I mentioned this UN example not just because the UN is a big and important organization, but because it's a big and important organization precisely, at least founded precisely to tackle peace and security. And a key symptom of this failure is the ad hoc and marginal inclusion of urban perspectives in global conversations about international security, from armed conflict to terrorism and organized crime. And a very concrete example of that, actually a few years ago in this very room, a friend of ours from the UN University pointed out that in the 2015 independent review conducted by a high-level panel at the UN, again, an example from the UN, on peace operations, this report, which runs for many dozens of pages, fails to mention the word urban and fails more broadly to integrate any specific urban issues. So this sort of oversight, this is just an example, but it contributes to the patchy and uneven progress in developing a concerted effort to promote security and development in a world facing rapid urban population growth. So another important obstacle for urban security, particularly for global cities, is this tension that we mentioned between the transnational aspects, the national remits, that is particularly strong in the transnational threats such as terrorism and organized crime, which requires international cooperation and intelligence sharing between powerful national security organisms, and the predominantly urban local impact of such threats. Many people here in London were affected and actually are still affected by the wave of fear that came with the rise in lone wolf terrorist attacks inspired by the Islamic State. As I myself was returning from an international conference on urban security, I saw that my local station, Parsons Green, had become a crime scene because I returned right at the night after the attack on Parsons Green, which happened at the same time that I take my train every day. And there was a CNN crew right in front of my door. The aim of these attacks is obviously not to destroy the UK's rail infrastructure, but to attack the shared sense of belonging and diverse exchanges that characterize cosmopolitan centers around the world. So one of the foremost national security threats of our time, which is terrorism, is also inextricably urban in its conduct and aims. And it is precisely this overwhelmingly urban manifestation of some of the key global security threats of our time that has allowed and even forced some global cities to increase their proactive involvement in these areas. So actually, in this city, this trend might be dated back to the city where we're in, London, which has been at the forefront since at least 1993, when local authorities implemented the so-called Ring of Steel against IRA attacks in the city of London, in the financial district. So despite its name, it actually consisted of a flexible set of plastic barriers, CCTV cameras, and police measures to regulate the flow of people and vehicles running through the city. This was actually a crude arrangement in comparison to the much more organic integration that we have now of urban measures, including urban planning, design, counterterrorism, integrating into the design of spaces and buildings. So following the 2005 attacks on public transportation here, the UK Home Office called for new efforts to design in counter-terrorism, an effort that is still ongoing and gained further support from the Royal Institute of British Architects. Furthermore, City Hall guidelines specify that, and I quote, "New development should incorporate elements that deter terrorists, maximize the probability of detecting intrusion, and delay any attempts at disruption." So obviously, not all of these initiatives are coordinated or even initiated by local governments, but they speak directly to areas that are under the responsibility of cities, and cities and their agencies have tremendous influence and responsibilities over these measures. But going further, the post-9/11 war on terror era and the recent wave of Islamic State-inspired terrorism has also provided further impetus for local authorities to increase their role in designing and implementing prevention and intelligence tools to fight terrorism. Therefore, going a bit further towards the strategic levels of security policy. A key local role in counter-terrorism work is already well integrated into the UK policy and practice, which is the concept of community resilience, defined by the World Bank as the social ties between different communities, governments, and markets, with strong community networks helping to bridge ethnic groups and quell tensions. And the UK's Prevent strategy has a similar aim, namely to make communities more resilient to terrorist ideology and propagandists. The most advanced model of city-led counterterrorism is also one of the most well-known ones, and some of you might have looked at that, which is the New York Police Department. It has approximately 1,000 officers working full-time on counterterrorism, and it has intelligence officials embedded in 13 cities worldwide. Global city agencies such as the NYPD bring unique urban traits to counterterrorism. For instance, they can integrate global intelligence on terrorism to the micro-level understanding of communities, streets, and local risks. So, for instance, the NYPD has conducted surges in police presence in certain areas responding to global intelligence and works constantly with service providers such as transit and port authorities to be able to detect threats and react early on. And crucially, the NYPD model is not an isolated case. Local counterterrorism officials have organized their own international gatherings, their own intelligence sharing mechanisms, although they are usually bilateral, and also organize some crisis exercises. And aside from intelligence, they also share best practices on securing sports events, for instance, or reacting to large-scale attacks. And finally, city-led policymaking is also growing in response to transnational organized crime. This is, of course, not coincidental, as crime is another form of global insecurity that disproportionately affects cities. As in the case of terrorism, the main influencers in this area have been the cities most directly affected by the problem. And in regards to criminal violence, that is very clearly Latin America. Another similarity with the urban responses to terrorism is that responses to criminal violence have evolved gradually, first as experiments and later spreading to other cities and countries. The departure point for these experiences have been the instruments that local authorities had at their most immediate disposal, which are police forces, of course, but also street design, architecture, local interlocutors. In other words, responsibility over the spaces and communities that are at the receiving end of the transnational chain formed by organized crime. The foremost example is Medellin, and in fact, I believe that Alexandra from LSE, are you here? No. Yes. So I will cite the model that Alexandra and others have coined, which is the Medellin model. Following a large-scale military operation conducted by then-President Álvaro Uribe in the slum known as Comuna 13 against FARC guerrillas and other groups, authorities, both local and national, followed this up with interventions into the urban space, starting with police and military bases to mark the permanent arrival of state authority. This was followed by local projects to build public libraries, slum upgrading initiatives, bold architecture work, and public transportation in order to link the slum to the urban society. And the cable car linking Comuna 13 to the rest of the city came to symbolize the city's renaissance from the headquarters of Pablo Escobar to the headquarters of the 2014 UN World Urban Forum, for instance. So yeah, in conclusion,
I'm going to be equally strict with you,
yes.
More so because you specifically asked me to be strict. So, you can round up.
Yes. So in conclusion, I think that global cities have an important role, not just in developing and testing ideas, but also in spreading and building strategies. So some of the networks that spread these strategies have been mentioned, but others, there are many others, including one that is quite local here, the Strong Cities Network, which is not far away from the IISS, which connects mayors and local practitioners from 120 cities and local governments to counter violent extremism. So obviously, as it is abundantly clear from the caveats that we've all been mentioned, there's still a lot to do. But what I try to convey here is that there are some unique capacities and areas of responsibilities that lead and sometimes even force cities to take a proactive and very active role in this security field.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Now, Carlotta, you are more used to asking questions than answering
It's
them.
nice to be on the other side for a change.
Yeah, it's great. It would be very interesting to hear your response to your fellow panelists. But I also do have a question for you, which is some of the things that Philip and Juliana mentioned about this tension between cities and the nation state points towards this difference between cosmopolitan cities and the rest of countries. And we've seen that to some extent with the referendum on the UK leaving the EU, that difference between urban centres like London and much of the rest of the country. So is that a cause for concern, that actually it's exacerbating that tension?
Yes, I think it is a cause for concern, and we need to have better integration, and we don't need to go even as further as London versus the rest of the UK. Just next week, for example, Toronto is having a mayoral election, and one of the major deciding factors is how the urban centre is going to vote in comparison to the suburbs. So we don't even need to go to a scale as big as an entire country to see where that divide happens and what works for a certain part of the population that lives and works in a certain part of the city versus the others. Now, I found it interesting that everyone mentioned the book, When Mayors Ruled the World, because that is a book that's, for us, at least at Monocle, was kind of like mandatory. And the program that I produced, The Urbanist, that was the starting point, was kind of that book, because it kind of culminated all these ideas that we had been discussing in a magazine for about 5-6 years. And then we decided to, create a radio show on urbanism. And when we started 6 years ago, we were the only radio show, internet-only radio show. We didn't even know we would be a podcast a couple of years later. That's how we would be called, exclusively on urbanism. There was a couple on design and architecture, but not on that. Yeah. And it's so amazing to look now, 6 years on, and see so many others in different parts of the world, in different languages, because it just shows that what happens in cities is no longer a case for just people that work with city policy, that do research on urban studies, and that actually, if you live in an urban centre, you should have an interest in what happens there. We do every year at Monocle a conference and a survey on quality of life, where we publish the 25 cities, not more livable, but quality of life, two different things. And a lot of people think that in our conference is all about where it's cool to live, and but actually our metrics take into consideration issues like security and terrorism, and the access to an international airport, and how easily that city is connected to other places. The cost of transportation is not just about being hip, and it's interesting to see every year which cities go up and down. And for example, London, because of the latest terrorist attacks here, went down in our latest survey. And some people are like, well, but the city hasn't changed that much. And it's interesting for us, also living here and being based in London, if you start walking down the street and now you're wary of having both your headphones on, then it has changed something for how you live in the city. If you feel I need to be aware of what's happening here. A discussion that emerged after the London Bridge attack was we've been so conscious in terms of planning and architecture to successfully make a more integrated public space, in the sense of you have the pavement, you have the bike lane, you have the road, and almost a seamless transition there. Aren't we making life easier for people that want to attack us? How do we change that? And should we change it? So what other measures are there to counteract it? And it is interesting to observe all these small discussions that start kind of, not doubt, but just start thinking about your city in a light that you didn't before. All those factors come in when you think about where you want to live. Not only where you want to live in the city, but which city in the world. So it's one of the many metrics we use. I also, just reacting to the panel, like how was mentioned, I believe it was Philip, about the EU regulation on air quality. And it's curious to think that up until 2016, most of the EU treaties, proposals, everything didn't even mention the words urban or cities in it. It was only, I believe, in the Amsterdam Convention that happened in 2016 that it became a crucial part of most of the texts of the European Union. It was always, this is going to be given to national government, and then it's up to them to unpack that and decide where it goes down, trickles down to local government, or it stays like that. So having this approach and this consciousness that something needs to be done in terms of empowering local government to be able to act on the issues that affect cities and municipalities directly, it's a wonderful thing to see that happening. And I mean, using the title of the book, I do think that mayors should rule the world. It would be much more simpler, but that issue of limited resources is literally what stops it. There's a network that is based in the US. It came out of the Rockefeller Foundation, called 100 Resilient Cities, and they decided to choose 100 cities to implement within City Hall the position of a Chief Resilience Officer. And the first thing most people encountered was unpacking what that officer would do. Because most people would think, oh, this has just to do with climate, if we have a storm that destroys our city. But actually resilience goes beyond that. It's about economics, it's about migration, it's about everything that you could do to improve the way a city reacts to something. And now the network is fully established. You have these 100 cities that have these positions within City Hall that have someone in a department directly working towards getting a city that reacts to things that some are predictable, others that just happen. In terms of migration, I remember when the whole discussion about sanctuary cities was going on, the Chief Resilience Officer for Boston, and at the time they were still setting up, she had just been nominated a couple of months before that, and together with the mayor they announced that, you know what, if anyone is scared of being deported, City Hall is a sanctuary place. You can come here and sleep here until we figure out what to do with you in terms of the help you need, in terms of lawyers, in terms of housing, in terms of benefits. And that is just one of the many, many examples. I'm sure Juliana can give even more about that, of how cities are reacting to where they feel government is failing or going against what represents the city's values. That's my main takeaway from this introduction.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. I'm sure there are plenty of questions in the audience. I'm going to ask just a couple of quick follow-ups. Philip, you mentioned spatial planning as one of the most important long-term policy tools for cities. It'd be quite interesting to get a sense of what does good spatial planning, what's the impact of good spatial planning on a city? What's the positive impact that can deliver? And in cases of bad spatial planning, what are the potential implications of that?
Okay, I'm going to answer this by bringing us directly to the ultimate policy outcome which spatial planning is aiming for, and that is about the production of good urban form. And then you get into the discussion, okay, what is good urban form? And there, I think over the last 20, 30 years, we have seen a relatively clear shift away from, first of all, modernist ideals. Sorry for sort of architectural speech here, but the idea of separating functions, the idea of therefore having quite sort of exclusive housing and business areas all separated. Quite a great deal of spacing between buildings. So that's a very strong established critique by now, where we have good evidence that the sort of that kind of urban form leads to problematic environmental, social, and also economic outcomes. I think more importantly than that critique is the critique of suburbanization. Just far too low density development, which then deprives the city from what the city is all about, which is a place where people can access each other, jobs, goods, ideas, and so on. I mean, cities, in some ways, if you think about it, are transport solutions. They provide, they optimize, they reduce the spatial friction to an optimum where then 20 million people in a metropolitan region like London can actually, on a daily basis, interact with each other. And for that you can have sort of more optimal urban forms which make that easier, that sort of transaction in space, where the distances aren't that great, where the distances are great, where you have reliable and good public transport rather than being stuck in traffic in your own car. All of those things play very much into this good urban form, good spatial planning. Now, if you want to achieve this outcome, what's there for the planning mechanism and the institutional capacity you need? Possibly the single most important thing is the level to which your government is able to integrate physical spatial planning all the way down to architecture on the one hand, and transport infrastructure, transport policy on the other. And if you look at how cities have traditionally dealt with these spaces, very separate, very independent from each other. And what a road engineer would usually favor and want to pursue was often the polar opposite of someone who would address an urban street with a sort of architectural urban design perspective in mind, quality of life in mind.
And Carlotta, I mean, you mentioned the book, If Mayors Ruled the World, this famous book, which I have been delving into lately. Now,
it was the book I recommended.
Good.
Now, it's full of jargon. And there's a lot of jargon out there. One of my spectacular favourites from the book was the radical moral geometry of a city. And the author's not even French. But one of the other pieces of jargon that has come up quite frequently in more recent literature that I've read is the concept of smart cities. Now, use of technology, integration of technology. Now, to what extent is this just a sort of marketing tool, or is it something that is really affecting life in cities?
Smart cities is one of those really funny terms that people love to use, especially mayors up for re-election or candidates. When I interview a couple of mayors for the program that are in those conditions, up for re-election or haven't still announced yet, they all like to say, oh yeah, we're going to make X, Y, and Z city a smart city. All right, what does that mean? A smart city, you don't know what that means? Yeah, it can mean a lot of things. Can you unpack that for me? I think a lot of it has become a marketing aspect because we know that the future is towards a more technological world, that startups and tech companies can be big business for cities if they manage to attract them to open an office or establish themselves there. So there's this idea that if you become a smart city, it's not necessarily about, we're all going to have our Oyster cards implanted in our wrists to go in and out of the tube, but also that investment side. I think there's still a long way to go until the term is fully unpacked in a way that someone will vote for a candidate because that's the way they want to go. I think for now, for me at least, it seems way more of a marketing a good marketing slogan that clearly has taken over the discussion. But yes, cities are moving at a rapidly fast pace in terms of the technological development, and some incidentally without even realizing that they're becoming smart cities themselves. Now this has to do with anything from transportation to security and the way, if something happens, you can easily target someone that tried to rob you or something, or if someone like you have a car crash or something like that. But it also has a darker side to it about the data that is collected and how much are we giving of our own movements and transactions without realizing. So I think it's still a field that, because it hasn't been unpacked properly, leaves a lot of room for people to do what they want with it, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
Questions from the audience. I'm going to take probably two at a time, I think, if there are two questions at a time. So please raise your hands. Please provide your name and affiliation, if you have one. Okay, I see two questions, one at the back and one in the middle. So first at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Amitabh Banerjee and I work for the Global Leadership Foundation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I found this fascinating discussion focusing largely on major urban conglomerations in what one would call the West. Chicago, New York, London, Paris. In the developing world, Are there situations that are different in Lagos or in Cape Town or in Mumbai or in Nairobi? And does the politics of cities make a difference? If a mayor is elected and a mayor has political ambition to be one day a national leader, does that make a difference, especially if the mayor and the president or the prime minister are from different political affiliations? Is it easier to deal with appointed mayors? Does that make greater synergy between mayor and president or prime minister of national government? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Marcus Geist. I represent the International Committee of the Red Cross. But I have more a question actually as Marcus Geist and not necessarily the ICRC. Although what Antonio said, of course, resonates very well with the ICRC. We are more in the business of towns and cities being destroyed as a reality of modern warfare, modern war. Think of Mosul, Gaza, Aleppo, and so forth. But yes, maybe more as an urban citizen myself, yes, it appears that this conversation is a bit of a, again, excuse my ignorance about cities, is slightly a little bit top-down. It's about mayors ruling the world. And I have to ask the question, what about people like me and probably most of us in here, what about urban citizens ruling the cities? Can we learn of these global cities ways how citizens can actually, yes, participate to the good running or at least improve the bad running of cities? Can we learn from that? And maybe particular minorities in cities. Our guest from Chicago, I understand it's about migrants. What about refugees, for example, in towns? Again, maybe more the towns that I'm more interested in, where you have got large refugee confederations. Again, what about the citizens have the possibilities to rule the city? And can we learn from global cities, especially where can countries learn from global cities about participation of it?
Thank you. Philip, you've worked a lot on cities in the developing world, so perhaps you want to start answering that question.
Yeah, Mr. Banerjee, I think a really important question, and sorry if it sounded we were focusing too much on the global north, because that's entirely inappropriate given where this urban age is actually taking place. So what's different in the global south or far east from here? I would say, the role of the very big cities is even further enhanced if you compare it certainly to Europe. It's often explained by, again, sort of transport costs at the time of major urbanization. The lower these costs are, the more you have a concentration in very big cities, which then leads often to an even greater superiority of these very big cities. So the Indian mega cities, the 4 or 5, are really even more prominent compared to, in fact, all of Europe may have only 2 big mega cities, Paris and London, and you can add Moscow and Istanbul, possibly. So that's a big difference. There's a stronger centralization, or at least centralization of political power at the where you have federal states, at the federal state level, or at the national government, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So where actually the self-governance of cities is far more limited compared to what we certainly know from the US, but also many parts of Europe. And that raises a whole new type of question about then the relationship with the vast hinterlands, often where the majority of populations still live. In most of those places, maybe outside of China, you will have an electorate which is majority rule, and you have then appointed urban officials which are appointed through a government elected by a majority rule electorate. And that leads to very particular dynamics in many of those places. I think there is a shift now away from, or the World Bank and many international agencies have always said, like, look, you can't prevent urbanization, let's embrace it, let's go for it. I think the latest iteration of this debate is to say, but you can't cram everyone in the only 1 or 2 big successful cities. Look at your B, C, D, and so on cities as well. Look at in situ urbanization that takes place in rural conditions where people are already residing. So that's a discussion which is currently coming back. I think, with the top down and bottom up, So clearly there are many cities which have lessons to be shared about more effective engagement with populations, and there's a scale of decision making which belongs entirely to citizens. No doubt about this, where they can engage, where also the representational issue can be sorted. I have not seen to date a very effective instruments to deal with strategic decision making at the city level. The big infrastructure, the big planning decisions, yes, we have some consultation and involvement, that seems to be working, but we don't have a real democratization of that. And where we have attempts, my colleague at the LSE, Michael McRae, has written a wonderful book about democratizing inequality. There's an enormous risk of elite capture of those efforts, of having a bigger say of the so-called general public. Guess who turns up at these meetings of the general public? I mean, the well-informed elite that can spare the time and have the resources to connect with the substance. So hugely risky if you move away from a representational story.
Yeah.
Juliana, have there been attempts to integrate immigrant communities or refugees into bottom-up governance in cities?
Well, the immigration story, so I always think of it when you ask about refugees in the United States. President Trump has also decreased the number of refugees he wants to take in. But it's a very, very different conversation than what has happened in Europe over the past few years. The United States doesn't have as much experience. I'll take that back. We do have a lot of experience taking in refugees, but it's not the same kind of waves or large numbers or rapid pace as was seen on the borders in Europe. In the United States, our history is more on the economic migration. It's people who have come over with legal status of some kind, or the southern border and Mexican border, and with Central Americans right now, I think, is where we're seeing the closest thing to refugees arriving at our border and trying to figure out what to do. But there's so many people in the United States who won't even recognize them as refugees because of the terminology and definition. So it's very, very complicated to go down that path. Once you're in the refugee process and you're resettled and you're taken care of and you have 3 months and your housing is established and you have some support to help find a job and you have a fast path to citizenship. So the process is a completely different one than for other economic migrants who are just coming to the United States looking for new opportunities. And that's why I tend to focus on the large 13% of our population with the foreign-born migrants. As far as integrating into the city policy and planning, I do feel like a lot of cities, and we've seen, I think even in just the latest elections in the United States, a lot of immigrants kind of stepping in and being elected into positions, more so than in previous years, really kind of taking on lots of new roles in all layers of government. One of the ones I know in Chicago that likes to celebrate a lot is like with undocumented immigrants, taking even positions on school boards and being involved in other parts of the community, not necessarily in elected formal governance positions, but in other types of decision-making roles. One of the things that struck me about your question, though, on the top-down of mayors ruling, it does feel actually counterintuitive to the whole point of Ben Barber's book, right? It's not about dictators kind of like taking over a city and telling the city what to do. It's the idea that they're more representative of the people of the everyday. They're on the ground, and then these voices should be heard around the world and really shaping the policy. So I do feel like that the mayor's ruling kind of sends the opposite message of what he was actually trying to convey in his message to the world, that cities have a real role in solving global challenges and in ways that we haven't looked to them in the past. We've always relied on the nation state. One of the reports that we produced at the Chicago Council actually looked at the top economies of the world, and we looked at kind of the strongest economies by nation and then by city. And what we found is in 100 of the strongest economies, wealthiest economies by GDP, 42 of them are cities, right? So like Tokyo's GDP is bigger than all of Saudi Arabia, for example. Chicago is in the top 42. So when we think of that power and that influence, if we've looked to countries to help solve global challenges, and I'll reference really briefly the G20 that's coming up, this is the first year the mayor of Paris and the mayor of Buenos Aires came together and convened a U20. I don't know if you've heard of this, but they're meeting at the end of October in Buenos Aires. It's mayors of these major cities of G20 countries countries coming together and putting together an agenda for G20 leaders to have an urban lens on the issues they'll be discussing. So it's that kind of concept of being able to influence change on big challenges that can come out of the potential with some of these cities.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that the whole point about the security, local-driven security policy is that the key element that cities add and mayors add is this ability to and responsibility over the community levels. So it's usually not a nation state agency or sometimes a state level, province level agency that gets there. But as in the example of Medellin, it was really the local authorities that were doing this bridge with the local communities and trying to get the development, the local engagement, the local community elements that were necessary, not just desirable, but necessary for the success of the democratic security policy that Álvaro Uribe had. Obviously, Alexander might correct me, but there were elements that didn't work, that needed more work. In Rio de Janeiro, the local element was very important and was very lacking. The sort of service provision, infrastructure provision to the slums that were supposed to follow the occupation of the slums by the military police, by the army, that the social component didn't happen to the extent that they desired. But this responsibility, this power and influence lies to a great extent with cities. So these communities, they feed into cities and national levels through those mechanisms, I think.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just a small comment on that of if the urban citizens can rule the city. A story that we reported last year, that's for me one of my favorite examples of how citizens taking over a city actually influencing the city hall was in Budapest, where 2-3 years ago they decided, the city local authorities decided to close the Liberty Bridge just for roadworks during the summer. It wasn't major roadworks, but they were like, okay, it's summer, we'll just close the entire bridge and just do it. And what happened was that every weekend, small group of people would climb over the fence and just watch the sunset while drinking a couple of beers at the bridge. Then on the second weekend, more people heard about it. And it became such a thing that the city hall, instead of getting the police to kick them out, was like, why don't we embrace this? And decided to allow it for that summer. When it got to the following summer, people were asking about, well, are we closing down Liberty Bridge? And mind you, like the roadworks were done. There was no reason to close it. But there was that thought, you know what? We survived last year without that link connecting, because there are other bridges that people can take. Why don't we close it for every weekend in the month of June and see how people respond? And because this time was, City Hall listening to what the citizens wanted, how they wanted to reclaim and use their city, space that is theirs as well, it became an organized thing. You would have groups of people that had a band that would play there. And this is nothing for money, just, it's a public space that you can use. And this time around, the third year in a row that this happened, the second legally, it was the event that everyone in the city was waiting for when the summer came around. It was in June, every Saturday and Sunday, we can just head to the bridge. You'd have families with kids like on skateboards and roller skating and running around, and it's safe. You'd have just groups of people just sitting just with their legs over the edge of the bridge, looking at the water, having fun, listening to some music, some performers. It was truly an example of what the citizens want to do with space that is theirs in the city. When the City Hall listens, it works, and it works for everyone. And I think now there's no doubt they're going to keep on doing that for the rest. Just a tiny story, because for me it has been one of my favorite examples lately of how listening to citizens works.
So, next round of questions. We have a question at the back, and then a question in the second row. We'll do 3 at the same time, in fact, but first of all at the back.
So, my name is Chelsea Bennett, and I'm a political analyst. I was wondering if you could speak more about affordable housing in cities. So as urbanization increases, more people want to live there, and there's this lack of affordable housing. And one thing that I've noticed kind of in my age bracket is that a lot of people in their late 20s maybe would like to have a family. You can't afford the second bedroom, so you can't afford to have a kid. And birth rates in the UK and in the US and in other parts of Europe are below that, 2 child per family or whatever. So I was wondering if you could talk more about this quality of life, affordability of living in cities, nexus, and how you see that moving forward, and what possible solutions that there could be.
Next question.
My name is Frank Dominy. I'm with Anglia Maghreb Smart City. I'm a great fan of Brenda Berman, so I'm delighted to see somebody from the highly enlightened Chicago here. My question and my area of interest is in the bidonville that we see rising around established cities in North Africa and driven by the migrant population. I see that as being very dangerous from the point of view of health and epidemics. Also by the transmission of hostile ideologies. And I really do not know what to do about a city like Dar es Salaam, where there are enormous slums surrounding it, and we don't know how many people are actually enclosed in those. How do we maintain control? How do we avoid being neo-colonialist and working the what Frederick Forsyth described as French decolonialization, where they pick the guy they want to be president, loan him a battalion of the Foreign Legion, and then he stays president until the French are happy with somebody else. I'm sorry if it's a long and complicated question, but these are real problems.
Yeah, hi, I'm Martin Woodhead from Equinor. My question is about the Chinese model of urban policing and this kind of model of intense surveillance that has got a lot of coverage in the last 2 or 3 months. I'd be interested in where the panel thinks the trend lines are going on that, and where they see the regions of the world where this is most likely to be replicated or adopted, potentially on the back of Belt and Road investments, etc.
Okay, so we have 3 pretty significant questions there. So the first one on affordable housing and quality of life and implications of the cost of living. Second question, particularly on these large cities in North Africa and East Africa as well, and issues of health and hostile ideologies and solutions to the problems there. And then the topic of surveillance in cities and a particular model of policing. Who wants to begin? And I'd ask us to keep the answers relatively brief so that we can have one more round of questions afterwards. Who wants to begin?
I'm going to just throw out a quick reference on the rising cost of living, because we convene a leadership group of mayors from around the world annually in conjunction with our Chicago Forum on Global Cities. And each year, I feel like that is the number one question that drives their conversation. They say the things that make their cities great, increased investments, new businesses coming in, new headquarters relocating, big universities, all these investments in the city that make it so attractive, are also the things that are driving up the cost for people to live there and displacing so many people who've been there for a long time. And figuring out that magical formula. I don't know cities, and the big cities, the big legacy cities, who have come up with the right answers of different kind of policies that they can grandfather in to try to control rent or create. I feel like there's a lot of experiments right now with either universal basic income, increasing minimum wages, just trying to figure out a balance. But one of the things that we've seen is that with the increasing, the rising of these tech, is that you do have this growing disparity. You have people with very, very well educated relocating to these cities with really, really high income jobs that keep growing, and then you're losing the middle class, right? In the United States, one of the things that we've seen a trend, and I'm sorry I keep going back to the United States, but that's kind of the lens that I'm looking at a lot of these issues through, is the return of the second-tier cities. And so all of these more livable places that aren't necessarily New York, Chicago, although Chicago is quite livable, I think, by New York standards. But LA, these other cities that are just San Francisco, extraordinarily expensive. And so you see a return to places like Louisville, Kentucky, who knew that was going to be this model little community to live in. But there's a very global city mayor there who's really progressive on immigrant integration and redeveloping the economy and coming up with different ways to attract young talent. And it's a very livable small city. So you see this the kind of a rise of cities across the United States that are kind of the non-traditional global cities. But it is definitely, I think, a big priority on all mayors' minds.
Yeah, I'm tempted to build on this because I have to admit on the other subjects, I mean, I could very briefly say, on the Chinese policing, I'm working now a lot in Ethiopia, and what's happening there is, direct follow-up, I'd say. And that's probably also not only because of sort of the Chinese developmental state and the connections that exist there, but it's also because there are similar attitudes about how you deal with dissidents and how you deal with security threats. But affordable housing, it's the big thing that if you ask urban residents in almost all contexts we are working in, is possibly number one urban policy concern. And I think that this idea of somehow this can help to rebalance not just a city internally, but a city system within a broader national or regional economy is a really important point. Because you have the double gains. You have for those that feel, I can't really afford the kind of housing I want, let's say in London, an opportunity elsewhere, and you then make a very important contribution to that location, which otherwise, it has certainly over the last 20, 30 years been suffering a decline. I think we need to recognize that a lot of sort of the housing markets are heavily distorted, particularly in this country, possibly also in the US, where it's a speculative market. It helps you with your pension payments in the long run, and that's really not helping. I think I would caution against blaming sort of international investors screwing up the local markets. That may be the case in some instances. I think the real issue in a place like London is between those that own property and that do not own property. And that's really the tension. So it's the parent generation for maybe a lot of us in the room. And that's what you need to look at, and the inequalities you have there and how space is distributed. And that needs to be solved through national policy. I don't think there's a city in the world that can deal with it. If there is a city that has dealt with it successfully, it's a city-state. It's Singapore. Built a lot of public housing. Another very good place to look at is Vienna in Austria, where I believe 60% of urban residents live in what is affordable housing, state-supported or in whatever kind supported housing. And we are starting to recognize that these are important models.
So very quickly, on the issue of surveillance, it's actually something that I wanted to squeeze into my presentation, but Nick wouldn't allow me. No, I left it out much earlier. But it's a real problem because as you move towards the concept of smart cities, and there are a vast number of actors moving to that direction, not just the private sector, but also even armed forces, the military, when they discuss the future of cities, they are counting on, they are factoring in that a number of cities will be smart, and governments themselves. And there are a number of benefits in bringing in data, gathering data, building data gathering into the systems that you build in the city, the buildings, the traffic systems, the police agencies, etc. And then obviously just gathering the data doesn't do anything. You need to collect the data. And then when it comes to basic data collection, I will cite the example of CompStat, which is a system that has been implemented in several US cities, which stands for Computer Statistics, I think. It's a very simple name, but it started in New York City with the idea that you collect data to detect hotspots before they become hotspots. So before that, you would someone got robbed, you would send a police officer, okay, who robbed you, etc. Then someone else would get robbed around the same area, you would send someone else. And then maybe in a few months you would, this area is a hotspot. Now the idea is that this data collection will much more quickly tell authorities that this is. So this started, and this has been very successful, and some argue that has had an effect in the reduction in homicide rates in the US in recent years. However, as you're getting into the smart city, and especially with the artificial intelligence debate, you are that sort of let's say low-hanging fruit, of medium-hanging fruit, which is data collection on more basic things like what kinds of crime, where they're happening. Now, smart cities are moving towards a next level, which is the collection of predictive information about specific communities or specific areas and the types of behaviors they're doing, so as to predict policing. And actually, there are a number of US cities, including Los Angeles, that have predictive policing programs. They're called predictive policing. And that's when we're starting to go much more directly into an ethical and privacy concerns.
Carlotta, I'd like you to respond, if you would, particularly to the second question. You've had hundreds of podcasts and spoken to people from all around the world. So what solutions do you see to some of those problems of the large cities with large slums around them?
Wow, that's a tough question.
Yeah, so someone has to answer it.
Yes, and I'm sorry that I'm not an expert in the issue, but from what we've been covering through the years and observing, it always has to do with money. At the end of the day, it's the economics of the city. And until that's solved, there's nothing you can do when it comes to improving health awareness, to improve the education, until you have that inequality from an area, a slum, and what's considered the center of the city, or from even one city to the other. You mentioned in your question hostile ideologies. And that is something that, particularly now when Europe had the latest wave of refugees, that everyone was worried about that. And when they're just economic migrants or fleeing conflict. And it was so worrisome to see a lot of the coverage there being worried about what sort of ideology would be brought up to Europe. It just, for me, it's just a completely wrong approach. And I think in the end, it goes back to that idea of inequality, deep inequality, that it just gives you access to different levels, not only of education, but a way of life. And until that is addressed, we really can't move forward. And I apologize that I can't give you a better answer, but it's just from what I've been observing. I just wanted to add one small thing on the affordable housing issue. Now, I'm from a generation that I don't know if I'll ever will be able to afford a house here in London. And it really baffles me when you see all these solutions coming up. Oh, we need to have, co-housing, or maybe we turn this empty office space in like little compartments where you can, you have your room and then the rest is shared. It's like, but what if I want a house? Is that ever going to happen for me? Now, we shouldn't be dismissive of those models because they exist and they're popular and they're emerging, because there are people that for them that works. If you're just moving to London for 1 or 2 years, maybe that's the best solution for you and not long term. But when those are presented as the solution, well, people can't afford apartments and homes, so maybe let's do this instead. That's when it becomes an issue, that we have what should be temporary and just for certain individuals, that is taken as this is a new norm. I'm sorry, you should have been born earlier. or have different parents. It's like there's nothing you can do, and that's like something that I think the discourse should change. And while it's important to, obviously, from my point of view, to cover these new ways of tackling the housing crisis, to wave the flag that this is the new solution, is wrong. And just on the China security surveillance mode, and following up on Antonio's comments, I think what worries me about that is when it stops being just for policing, when you have in China the social credit system, which for me is out of a science fiction movie. I can't believe that is happening. And if people are not familiar, essentially is using that same technology that should be used to protect you. They rate you as your social behavior from, I don't know the numbers, but let's say from 1 to 10. If you're a smoker, you throw a cigarette on the floor, -20, and then that will influence if you can buy a house, if you have access to a mortgage, what sort of, I wouldn't say taxes, but what sort of fees you pay for certain items. It analyzes what you buy at the supermarket. Oh, too much meat, that's bad. Even everything in your behavior starts to be assessed. And that's for me when that line becomes very dangerous. Because one thing is to talk about predicting behavior so they could keep you safe. The other is predicting behavior because that someone considers you to be a bad citizen, so you shouldn't have the same sort of opportunities.
Philip, you wanted to add something on the second question?
Yes, because I think in some ways that really deserves a bit of a further reflection, although it's not an answer to this very complicated issue of peripheralization. I mean, one of the poor and migrant populations or disadvantaged populations more generally, one needs to sort of resist the temptation of purely branding it complete horror, because I think there is a lot of value created in some of those settlements which one can learn from, which one can take on board. But I also completely recognize the concern. And I think there are a few fundamental principles which go back to urban planning, which are important. Number one is you don't ignore it as a starting point. That's the biggest mistake you can make. You are, of course, trying policies which mitigate the vast concentration of poverty in one location, and have a degree of distribution of those populations, breaking it up with slightly more affluent populations which bring in services, which bring in other opportunities for employment, maybe is certainly an advantage. You could take this to an extreme, which I'm not at all advocating for. I'm just going to share this with you because it gives you a sense of how certain governments are dealing with those issues. And it brings me back to Addis Ababa, where in 2005 the country recognized that there was quite a lot of dissident in some of the urban, also informal neighborhoods, and one of the world's largest public housing program was established. Now that public housing program, which has vast amount of new houses being built, typically 4 or 5 stories at the urban periphery, then assigned these new apartments to formerly informal dwellers. But it not only did assign them to, I mean, this is a very, very sophisticated state operation of gaining control over these residents. The distribution was very sophisticated. They got coded in terms of what kind of residents they are, and they were mixed up with people that were loyal to the regime. Every 5th and 6th person in these apartments is essentially a party member. And that was, again, an attempt to just ensure that you don't breed complete dissident at scale. Pretty horrible for, I think, sort of a more democratic approach, but that is one approach a state has chosen.
Can I just add another quick example, and I know we're on our time, but one slum that right now is getting a lot of attention, and I'd like to see how this plays out as a model, is in Buenos Aires. It's the Barrio 31 that the mayor has been very proud of. But rather than trying to dissolve the slum, which had 35,000 residents living there on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, between the port, he chose to integrate it and formalize it as part of the city. And by bringing the services, paving the roads, bringing electricity, investing in it as part of the city. And I've heard him present where he moved his office. So City Hall for him, he has downtown Buenos Aires, 3 days a week he meets there, and then 2 days a week he has his office in Barrio 31, which he says he schedules all kinds of meetings. It's not just meetings about the barrio, but anybody. It's just Tuesdays and Thursdays you can find me at that office, and that's where I do my business. And it's about really trying to integrate and formalize the neighborhood as just another neighborhood in the city, as opposed to trying to dissolve it and figure out what to do with it.
Thank you. I wanted to do another round of questions, but if you do have questions, please do come and ask them directly to the speakers afterwards. I'd like you all to give a round of applause to our fantastic panel, but also thanks to our colleague Tom for organising the logistics of the event. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.